Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee Talk with Immigration Attorney Brian D. Lerner. I have some new headphones in this particular video. Um, Hopefully, you'll be able to hear better. It's supposed to have a really good pickup of the microphone, and it's supposed to take the background noise and make it disappear. So let me know. What I'd like to talk about in this particular video is bond hearings and what's involved, what the procedures are, how it works, and possibly how the you can fight a bond hearing or whether you don't have a chance and what some of the defenses are. So let me just tell you initially what basically is a bond hearing. Why would you need one? And naturally, we're talking in an immigration setting here. The typical procedure or typical situation is somebody happens to be in criminal detention. Let's say they're finishing up a sentence for whatever it is. Let's say they got assault and battery or whatever they happen to get, and they were to serve 30 days in jail or 60 days in jail, and lo and behold, they think they're about to get out, and ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, puts a detainer on them. And as far as they're concerned, they have uh, the sheriff or the pardon officer, whoever, comes up to them and says, "Sorry, we can't let you go. There's an immigration hold on you." And then, sure enough, once they're done with their sentence, they are immediately put into immigration detention, and they are transferred to an immigration detention facility where they are put into removal proceedings. And the basic thrust there is then they either are or aren't given a bond, uh, and they can either pay it there or not pay it if they're given, and then they can renew or have a bond redetermination hearing in front of the immigration judge, at which point the judge will agree or not agree, and if the judge gives an amount, that amount is paid, and then the person's released. So that's the uh, real, in a nutshell, summary of a bond. Now, what exactly is a bond? Why does this issue come up at all? Well, the idea is that somebody who is in detention and who's having removal proceedings go forward while in detention, of course, they would prefer uh, to be free while they're, doing their removal proceedings. I mean, obviously, anybody would prefer that they, just go to court when they're supposed to go to court, and then when they're done, they go back to work. They, continue their lives as normally as they can, rather than being in detention day after day. So why a bond? Well, what the bond does is it's set for a certain amount. Let me just throw a figure out. Let me say $5,000. What that $5,000 does is it allows the uh, basically the immigration court or ICE to allow you to go free. And by you paying, or by your family paying $5,000, and again, that number could vary. It could be more, it could be less, whatever it might be. But by paying that $5,000, what that tells immigration is that because you put $5,000 into immigration, into their fund, uh, you are much more inclined to go to all of your hearings and to follow the directions of both the immigration court and ICE, and to do what you need to do so that your case can properly be processed. Now, what happens if you don't do that? What happens if you forget to go to court, or if you say, well, I think I have a better chance if I hide up in the mountains, in Colorado and never turn back? Well, if you do that, if you don't go to your hearings and you don't listen to immigration, then what happens is you just gave a nice present to immigration. Your $5,000 has disappeared. If you do go to all your hearings and you do do what's necessary, then at the end of the whole process, you get your money back. Now, getting it back is not as easy as just walking in the door and saying, hey, I followed all your directions, please write me a check and give me my money back. It's not quite that easy, but still, you fill out the necessary forms, you do the necessary procedures, and you are then able to get the money back. So that, number one, by itself is one big reason that they issue bond, to assure that you are going to go to your hearings and follow what needs to be followed as far as instructions from the immigration court and from ICE. Now, obviously there's other factors that will come into play if you don't do what you're supposed to do. I mean, minus losing the bond, if you don't go to court, you'll get an order of deportation in absentia. Then, of course, they can pick you up and remove you. As far as the bond itself goes, if you can't pay the whole cash, all of the cash to get the bond, then there are bond companies, and they usually will take 10%, and then they'll put a lien on your house, your car, your property, whatever it is. They can put various liens to again force you to pay them back, and also they're on the hook to make sure that they notify you when you need to go back to immigration. So there's various ways of paying for it, and it would definitely be in your benefit if you get the bond to do so. Now, given that, there's some issues you need to be aware of. Now, let's say that you do qualify for bond. Well, the problem is normally ICE will set the bond at some unreasonably high, outrageous figure. Sometimes they'll set it at $20,000, sometimes at $50,000. They'll set it a lot of times at numbers that you just can't get to. And if you can, you're leaning up your whole house. You're taking all your savings. So a lot of times, if you don't just happen to have that money sitting around and ICE just happen to issue that high amount, then you want to wait. You want to wait in detention until your first hearing in front of the immigration judge. And when I'm representing people, that's when we do the bond redetermination hearing. Okay, and it's exactly what it says. Because ICE either issued a bond where they said you could pay, $20,000, $30,000, or they said you don't qualify for bond and didn't issue it. Either way, you're asking the judge to redetermine that decision so that a new bond can be issued in an amount that's much fairer. Now, I can tell you lots of times that immigration will issue the bond at somewhere in the neighborhood of $20,000, $30,000, and when we get in front of the immigration judge and we do a bond redetermination hearing, many times we'll get it down to $3,500 or $5,000. Okay, and while I know it's no pleasure being in detention, if you're going to be in detention, and wait there for another 5 days or so, maybe sometimes up to 10 days. By the time you get in front of the immigration judge and get the reduced bond, a lot of times you're saving $15,000, $20,000 by doing that. So that might be something that you have to think of, and something realistically you have no way around. So that's one issue. And then the way that it'll work is once let's say we do the bond redetermination hearing, once the judge issues the amount, just have one of your family members go to the proper location, which every immigration court will let you know where that is, and then bring a money order. They obviously won't accept checks. Bring a money order, made it for the correct amount, and then you'll get the receipt. You'll get proof that you paid it all, and then what'll happen is you can bring that proof to the immigration detention facility to prove that it's been paid, and expect to wait for quite a while that day. So bring a book, bring your laptop, whatever, and just sit down, and they will process the whole situation. And they, many hours later, normally, the detainee will then be released. Now, what does that mean when the detainee is released? Well, it means that they still have to go to immigration court. they're still in removal proceedings, and they still have to fight their case. The case will normally be transferred to the jurisdiction where the person lives, to the non-detainee cases. So let's say that they were up in Lancaster, California, and you got them bonded out. Well, then it's going to move to Los Angeles, and what'll happen is you will get a notification from the court as to when the next hearing is. Now make sure that you follow up on that, because it would be a shame if you're released but then your court hearing was still set at the detained facility. If that's the case, then of course you need to notify them. You may need to physically go back if it hasn't been transferred out, and do what is appropriate at that time. Okay, so that's the basics of the procedures of how the bond hearing works and what needs to be done. Now, what are some other issues that you need to be aware of when you're dealing with bond? Well, first of all, as I had stated at the beginning of this particular video, normally if you're in criminal detention, there's a detainer that is put on you by ICE. Okay, now there's some misconceptions of what begins the detainer and how it works. For all intents and purposes, essentially ICE calls the either federal, local, or state facility where you are and basically says they are federal immigration officials and they want to pick up, and they want to pick up the detainee, but they more importantly want the facility that's currently holding the detainee to continue to hold him until such time as they can pick him up. Well, keep in mind, and this is where a lot of the ambiguity comes in, that a detainer is voluntary. It's not mandatory. The facility that is holding the detainee does not have to abide or keep the detainee day after day after day or week when they're going forward. And so therefore, if you have an attorney who knows what they're doing and a detainer has been put on this particular detainee, but there's been no transfer, especially it's been more than 48 hours, then you can make various motions to request that that person be released. And there's various ways of going about doing that, calling ICE, calling the state facility, showing them that it is voluntary only, it's not a mandatory request by the federal government, doing a habeas corpus in federal court to show that they are unlawfully being held after their criminal sentence was completed. There's different ways of doing that. So what you want to know is that keep that 48 hours in mind. That's the most important thing here. So they really cannot maintain the alien for a period of more than 48 hours, and that does exclude Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays, in order to permit the immigration or ICE to take custody. Now, there's some other issues too in request to the bond hearing itself. If you're doing a bond redetermination hearing, there's a few things, of course, that you want to show in order to get, number one, the least amount of the bond, and number two, to get the bond. You want to show you're not a flight risk, okay? That the moment they release you, you're not going to head up into some mountain somewhere and disappear forever. That you have incentive to go to your hearings, and a lot of times, if you have the relief available to you, let's say you qualify for cancellation of removal or adjustment, or you have a good chance at a waiver, there would be no reason to fly, to the risk of flight, because you have a decent chance of winning your case. And if you have a decent chance of winning, why would you not show up and get a deportation order? So these are the kind of arguments we make. You also want to show you're not going to be a danger to society. So let's say that you have a domestic violence charge and you served a few months. A lot of times the person whom you committed it upon, has sought forgiveness and can issue declarations. A lot of times you can issue other declarations from work, religious, from other officials to show that either this was a one-time incident or that it's not within your nature. There's different things you can show, and it all depends on the crime itself and so forth. Now, when you're doing the bond hearing, it's kind of strange here, but it's off the record. So you actually bring in all of the conviction documents, and you bring in all of the items that normally in a regular immigration hearing you would never, or your attorney would never admit to. But for a bond hearing, you have to, because you have to show that what happened and what the risks or lack of risks would be. And so based upon that, the immigration judge is not supposed to use any information obtained from the bond hearing in the regular immigration court proceedings. This is kind of strange in that you're asking the judge to segregate his or her mind once it does move on to the immigration court hearings, but that procedurally at least is how it's done. Now, there is one issue that we have not talked about, and that is mandatory detention. Regardless of all the arguments I told you, and regardless of whether or not the person is not a flight risk and so forth, there is a law out there. It's referred to as 236A. That's of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and basically the way that works is that states that under certain circumstances, a person is does not qualify for bond. It doesn't matter if you're the most sympathetic judge on the earth, or if ICE really wants to give you a bond and let you go. If you're under mandatory detention, then everybody's arms are tied and you cannot be released on bond. So what are the cases where someone is mandatorily detained? Well, there's a list of various crimes by itself that you have to fall under, but more importantly, you have to be released from any form of non-ICE physical restraint, and you then have to be released into ICE custody. Okay. And the release had to occur after October 8th, 1998. Now, if it falls under that particular provision, that's where, when I come in, that's where I fight the case, because I try to argue that the client is not subject to mandatory detention, that it didn't fall within either non-ICE custody physical restraint, or that it wasn't even restraint, or there wasn't custody. There's all kinds of arguments that could be made to show that it falls under this particular provision. Also, if the whole purpose of this is that one of the crimes was committed by the client, then we can of course try to vacate or reduce the crime so it doesn't fall under one of the enumerated statutes in order to make the person subject to mandatory detention. Okay, there's other issues regarding the bond, but basically in this particular regard, what I've tried to do is give you a heads up of essentially what the bond is, what the motions are, what the defenses are, how to argue, at least in some degree, against them, and so forth. So if you know someone who is in detention, who has mandatory detention or not, but the bond's too high or bond's not given, just give me a call. I'll be happy to give you a consultation, and we'll see what we can do to help in that regard. Okay, more on the coming video.